At the advent of the 20th century, the rules to war had changed. No longer were the days of defeating an enemy force and killing the men whilst enslaving the women and children, and when both World War I and World War II hit, all sides were met with an unfamiliar hitch in their logistics. What to do with the excesses of men they had captured in battle? In today's front video, we'll only be covering World War II POWs, and we'll be taking a look at 8 main belligerents and how they handled their prisoners of war and how their prisoners of war handled them in some cases. Without further ado, let's get into the video. The first country we'll be covering on our list is Germany. Now, in World War II era Germany, if you asked both an enlisted American or British officer and a Jew or Slav on the conditions of their confinement, you would get 2 wildly different answers. The Nazi Party, of course, believed that everyone Jewish and essentially everyone to the east was inferior, whilst everyone considered Nordic or Aryan were in their good books and equal to them. As a result of this, dependent on what race you were, you could expect to either be gassed or worked to death, or to be treated to a relatively mild prisoner of war experience. I do have to say though, that even in the non-Slavic and Jew POW camps, many Nazi guards were extremely strict and heavy-handed with the punishment tools they had at their disposal, most notably solitary confinement. In addition to this, they did not take escape attempts very lightly, and as many of you will know, in The Great Escape, 50 of the 73 recaptured men were summarily executed by the Gestapo because Hitler was angry. Although uncommon amongst Western prisoners of war, executions like this did happen if you managed to piss off the wrong person on the wrong day. Exact figures are hard to pinpoint, especially with prisoners of war. However, the biggest complaint of British and American POWs were usually food and boredom, whereas Eastern European soldiers were treated with the utmost cruelty. A statistic to note is that of 5.7 million Eastern European prisoners of war, an estimated 3.3 million died in captivity, a grim 57.5% of the total captured. The Italians, to put it bluntly, weren't ready to fight a war, and their internment camps showed this. With their largest influx of prisoners coming from the early successes of the Desert War in North Africa, they managed to capture many Australians, New Zealanders, and South Africans. By all accounts, many Allied prisoners became frustrated at the ineptitude and disorganization of the Italian camps. Many felt contempt and embarrassment at the fact that they'd been interned by such a lackluster force and came to oddly admire German efficiency and organization on the back of that. Regardless, Italian POW camps were some of the most relaxed in the entire war, and the guards working there would often trade with prisoners and turn a blind eye to the disobedience of regulation. The only problem the men had to face in these camps were food shortages, and both the prisoners and the guards were given meager rations to live off. All in all, despite the malnutrition, there was no form of mass brutality in Italian camps, and the only way a prisoner could die was through a combination of malnutrition and disease. The death rate here was therefore understandably very low. Japan here needs no introduction. The estimated 140,000 POWs taken by the Japanese were the unluckiest of the war, as Imperial Japan had pretty much no regard for the Geneva Convention. As I've stated in prior videos, Imperial Japan revolved around a primal culture that believed in honor above everything. In short, meaning death before surrender. If you were unlucky enough to be an Allied soldier in the Pacific surrendering to them, they interpreted that as the ultimate form of weakness and dishonor, and they thus saw you as subhuman. The Japanese used all their prisoners as slave workers and regularly beat and tortured prisoners for the fun of it. Flat out execution, medical experimentation, and intentionally restricting rations were also not uncommon, and therefore the death rate of Western POWs was a hefty 27.1%. For Allied airmen, this figure rose to a shocking 40% mortality rate, as the Japanese wanted to make an example out of them. Although these figures were bad, what was worse was their treatment of other Asian prisoners of war, specifically the Chinese. While over 80,000 Western Allied POWs would survive and walk out of the camps by the end of the war, a mere 56 Chinese did, as Japan refused to acknowledge them as POWs and kept them interned for ages after the war. Now, as if this wasn't all bad enough, the Japanese had an ultimatum order that was to be carried out if they had to retreat to defend Japan. This order was called the Kill All Order, and we actually have a video on it, and it demanded the extermination of all prisoners of war by whatever means necessary. Thankfully, the dropping of the nukes forced Japan into an early surrender, and this horrible order was never realized. If you were a German or Italian soldier captured in the field of battle, getting sent to a POW camp in England, Canada, Australia, or New Zealand was probably your best bet. All of these countries were under British influence and treated their prisoners extremely well. Every captured soldier could fully expect for his rights to be adhered to, as all of these countries followed the Geneva Convention to the letter. In Australia, for instance, the Italians were so happy to be away from the war that the guards trusted them to work outside of the camp boundaries unguarded, and not a single Italian attempted escape. This was a common theme for 99% of Italians and many Germans as well, who were nestled away far from the war and didn't necessarily want to go back. It should be noted though, that the few Japanese that were caught, and I mean few, were not as happy to be getting good treatment from the Allies. Already disgraced by the fact that they had survived battle, what made it worse was that they weren't being punished for it and were being treated nicely, which led to entire Japanese compounds rebelling at their captors in both New Zealand's Featherstone camp and Australia's Cowra camp. In the end though, these incidents were a drop in the pond, and the fatality rate in the Commonwealth was 0.03%, with a mere 1,254 POWs out of 3.6 million knocking on the door of death. Depending on who you ask about this one, the Americans were either the same as the British or as bad as the Russians. Although from most historical accounts, POW camps run by Americans followed all the Geneva Conventions and some, there are theories that the Americans systematically starved hundreds of thousands of Germans in conjunction with the French. Although I don't believe this, I just wanted to let you all know that this theory exists. Otherwise, from the memoirs of German naval officers interned at places like Papago Park in Arizona, the Americans were extremely lenient even with die-hard Nazis. It got to a point where the public began to push for harsher treatment of German POWs because of the stories they were hearing about the SS overseas in the murder of American GIs and prisoners. The stats, however, speak for themselves, and like England, the US had a very low mortality rate at 0.2%, or 5,802 deaths of the 3.097 million prisoners in the country. Last but not least, we have Russia. Russia, as is to be inferred, did not have a great relationship with the Germans. As the Germans were cruel to the Russians were cruel to the Germans, and there was little to no hint of the Geneva Convention anywhere. The Russians sent many prisoners to gulags where they were worked to death, and often summarily executed high-ranking Germans and Poles. They were apathetic in how they handled their lower-ranking POWs, and although many Russian soldiers wouldn't actively look to kill them, they weren't doing them any favors either and essentially let the weather do the work. Of the 3.15 million prisoners of the Soviet Union, there was a fatality rate of just under 35%, meaning approximately 1.1 million died. Now guys, I feel like I've just brushed the surface when it comes to POWs, POW camps, POW escapes, and everything to do with prisoner of war camps, so let me know in the comment section below if you want me to do another video detailing some of these other aspects. And just before you go, I want to give a big thank you to all of my patrons who really do help with the improvement of the quality of these videos. I know that I have dropped them down to 1 a week, but I am making the videos longer and we hope we can increase it to 3 a week again if we get enough patrons. So make sure you check out that link in the description below. And if you also want to chat to other history buffs, make sure you check out our Discord. That link is in the description below as well. Anyways guys, as always, thank you for watching and I hope you learned something new.